Okay, you guys, here we go. I have about 2 hours of stuff that I want to share with you guys and a half hour to do it in. I even put a timer on for a half hour, and hopefully I'm going to shut up at the half hour mark because I really want to honor your guys' time. But I also want to give you everything that's in my heart. So I'm not going to look at the comments. Please comment because I want to know what you're thinking in response to what I'm saying so I can develop this throughout the week. Um, I have everything from beginners to advanced here, and I believe I have something for all of you. I'm super excited because I believe what I'm going to share with you is a secret that's been brewing in God's heart around the prophetic art for possibly hundreds of years. Sean Bowles had said in that article I shared with everybody that God was going to empower those who are not typically chosen to solve world problems. Well, who solves world problems, you guys? I'll tell you who. We normally go to the intellectuals, don't we? Nobody thinks to go solve world problem. Let's go meet and talk to an artist. Yet that is exactly where God is hiding his genius. I'm going to ignore my phone. So what else was that? So my phone distracted me. So I am going to pretend that I am having a cup of coffee with you guys right now. And gosh, Dane, of course this is going to happen when I'm talking to you. Technology. Sorry, guys. Okay, sorry. I'm going to pretend I'm having a cup of coffee with you. And I am going to talk your ear off, and then at the half hour mark, ask your forgiveness. When you see me panic at a half hour because of everything I didn't say, you can just laugh at me. But let me tell you a little bit about me before we go forward. For those of you who don't know, my background is in aviation. I have an aviation science degree. I was a bush pilot, flight instructor, did scenic flights. Always wanted to be an artist, but didn't think that was really for me. Most of you can probably imagine that. In fact, in those years, I lived in Alaska in a little tiny cabin in the middle of nowhere because of my desire for art. And by the way, desire, that's your secret of knowing whether you have genius or not. If you have a desire in an area, that's genius. Okay, back to the Alaska cabin. One of the things that I did, because I lived in the middle of nowhere, is I bought that series. I don't know if a lot of you guys know the Time Life series that used to be old encyclopedia-like books on the art masters. And I bought the whole set, read them through, and the very first book was Leonardo da Vinci. And I did everything that they said they did. And one of the things they did, you guys, the masters, okay, the art masters, they copied. They copied. Now, fortunately, I did not go to an art school. I was mad that I didn't get to go to an art school, but I didn't know God's grace on me because in art school, they train you that it's a bad deal to copy. And I'm telling you that copying is one of the fastest ways you have to learn. So I just want to free you up. Copy. I highly recommend copy people who are good. And I'm going to give you some hints on how you know if they're good or not throughout the rest of the week. But copying is a very important part of skill development, maybe one of the most essential, right after some good solid training. Anyway, so I was an artist who didn't know what she was doing, but mostly I was the pilot. Then I went through a divorce. I ended up moving to Oregon to be near family. Then I started doing art even more. I was doing scenic flights, but I also started teaching art. I barely knew how, but I started teaching it. And my workshops grew until I would have a huge list of people wanting to get in, waiting list, and they couldn't get in, and I'd have to hold a whole nother workshop. That was to the world market outside of the church, and I did very, very well. Then in 2008, all hell broke loose. Because in 2008, if you guys recall, the economy went to heck, and suddenly nobody could afford to come to my classes because most of them came from like all over the place. Florida, Ireland, they were not local people. And so suddenly I was going broke. And this is when it happened. Okay. So picture this. I'm living in a rusty old manufactured home on a river in a tiny little town of about 50 people, about 5 miles off the Oregon coast. It's cold, it's rainy, and I am now near broke. Actually, I was broke. I was fully broke. But God was not letting me off the hook about teaching painting and teaching art. And all my friends and my family are like, Lynn, you got to go back to flying. You can't just keep doing nothing and play with your art all day. You guys probably relate to that. You can't play with your art. Hey, let me tell you something. I'm going to sidetrack here. A lot of you are having issues. Lynn, how am I going to have the time to do this? You don't know how packed my schedule is. Let me tell you something. Time is a resource exactly like money. And if you handle money kingdom way, God will bend things. Like if you tithe, somehow when you give, you get more. So I'm going to suggest to you, because God told me to suggest this to you, that when you give your time to Him in the direction that I'm going to be sharing with you this whole week, that is time sitting at Jesus's feet, very much like Mary did. And remember how Martha said, well, you should be doing other work with me. And Jesus said, she's picked the better thing. And I believe that when you spend your time, when you make it a priority, and you're going to want to when you learn more of what I have to share with you, when you make it a priority, God is going to bend time for you, and you are going to get more time back in all those other areas. Okay, back to the night. I'm sick. I'm broke. And I had a river in my backyard, and it was flooding. And I'm frustrated at God because, I'll be honest, I was mad at Him because I had on purpose not pursued flying and was pursuing art, and it was going to heck. And I'm like, what's this about, God? And now I'm so sick as well that night that I can't even get out of bed. And I recall very much in a pouring rain, dark night, rusty old manufactured home, river is flooding. An officer knocks at my door, and I hear him yell from my front door, you have to evacuate. If there's anybody in there, you have to evacuate. And I couldn't respond. I was too sick, and I lived alone. And I remember being devastated when I heard him drive off, because I'm like, he doesn't even know I'm in here. Nobody knows I'm here. Nobody knows in the whole world that I'm supposed to evacuate, and I can't even move. And then when you know it, that's when God shows up. And He shows up in the most unexpected way. Oh my gosh. So laying beside my bed, because I can't move, is a little tiny green book, which I even pulled out. It's this little tiny green book right here. It's a book by Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill wrote a book called Painting as a Pastime. This used to be required reading to all my students. And that particular night, I'd probably already read it 10 times. But I'm looking at it beside my bed, and all of a sudden I get a download directly from the book into my head, because I'd already read it numerous times. And I'm remembering that Winston Churchill, which a lot of you may not know, but he was a very prolific artist. But in this book, he tells you that the reason that he could carry the responsibilities that where he got the insights from, he believed all came. I was going to show you the front page of this. Probably don't really have time. Okay, here's one of his paintings in the back. But what he believed, all his amazing genius came from out of his painting time. Okay? And I get to thinking about that out of the blue. This officer is just driven off. And I hear God say, Lynn, it's the leaders who need to learn art. Oh, right, God. Right. I'm going to go tell leaders they need to learn art. They're going to receive that well. And it's like God totally ignores me and he goes, no, I want you to listen up. And he began to drop in puzzle pieces from my life. Back when I had studied the Time Life books, when I had studied geniuses, when I had studied specifically Leonardo da Vinci, and how da Vinci, when he was asked, what is the secret to all your genius? Not just his genius as an artist, but his genius as a scientist and in the medical realm. I mean, you guys, he's still known as the most prolific genius throughout history. And when he was asked the secret to his genius, he replied, saper videre, which means to know how to see. And as soon as that puzzle piece dropped into my head, I realized God was telling me something very important, because when I teach people art, I'm telling them, I'm not teaching you what to do with your hands or anything, or what to do with your brain. I'm telling you what to do with your eyes. I'm teaching you how to see. That is the whole secret to learning how to draw. And apparently, it's the whole secret to genius if you were to ask Da Vinci. And all of a sudden, I forget that the river's flooding and I'm supposed to evacuate, and that I'm sick and I'm broke. I am so excited. I'm up all the rest of the night. And I go back and I remember things that I learned that Einstein had said. And he had said that everything came to him visually. The hard part was putting it into words. And I'd love to share more about that, but I can't right now. And anyway, all of these things came together, you guys. And I realized this is it. I'm teaching people art. And this is how, I don't know how many of you guys remember the Seven Mountain Prophecy. For those of you unfamiliar with it, it was when three of the greatest leaders at that time in different colleges, one was Bill Bright, one was Lauren Cunningham, and one other guy. And God had spoken to each of these three in a dream and said, you three need to get together. I have something to share with you. And when they flew together to meet in the same city, because they both all had the dream, God shared with them that, and this is out of Numbers, that he wanted to bring the church up so that we were no longer the tail, but the head of the church. We were the head in all seven mountains of society, whether that's medicine or science or government or education or family. And we're meant to be the head and not the tail. And I was familiar with that prophecy, but that night, God told me, Lynn, everybody's waiting for me to make him the head and not the tail. And the truth is, I'm waiting for them, because they need to develop in the skill development, and you hold some keys to that. And man, you guys, I sure couldn't sleep. Because I learned that art skills teach visual thinking. And that's an important term for you, visual thinking. And one of the fastest ways to learn visual thinking is through the arts, you guys. And visual thinking is not just Da Vinci, not just Einstein, not just Churchill, but Tesla, Steve Jobs, all of them said their insights, their genius came through visual thinking. Now, I think it isn't an accident or just a lucky thing that it also happens to be the language of kingdom. And so what I'm going to share with you guys really quick, I call it my iceberg analogy. I want to tell you about your mind and the power of your mind. And I use the metaphor of an iceberg. And we've all heard how our minds are like an iceberg, but we only use like the top 10%. And I hope you guys can see this. So if I were to draw an iceberg, okay, they say in our educational system, and they're right, we only use 10% because our educational system only teaches 10% of our brain. This is our conscious mind. This is our subconscious mind, okay? This is our conscious mind. When we go to school for 12 to 18 years, we are taught in our conscious mind the 3 R's of reading, writing, and arithmetic, and academic literacy, which teaches us rational thinking, linear thinking, because when you read words through a sentence, that's linear thinking. Math, 2 plus 2 plus 2 is 6. That is linear thinking. It's logical thinking. It's academic thinking. And our culture believes that if you're smart, all your smarts comes from your academic schooling. Well, guess what? Neuroscience is saying today that the subconscious mind rules 90% of our lives, 97% of our lives. But here's what's interesting. The language of the conscious mind is verbal. Okay, that doesn't look like verbal, but that's verbal. The language of the subconscious mind is visual. And if you guys think of it, this is the language God speaks to us in primarily across the board. And even in scriptures, you hear in Jeremiah, Jeremiah's whole educational curriculum for him, God said, what do you see? What do you see? That's right in chapter 1. So what do you see? And God will speak to us through the things we see. But the problem is we don't know how to see. And that's why Da Vinci said we need to learn how to see. And so I'm teaching a visual language for your subconscious mind, which is where all your creativity and all your innovation and genius insights come. And it's also where we are the most receptive to the kingdom. We are so more receptive to the kingdom. And you know who knew this, you guys? You know who knew all of this for hundreds of years? The enemy. The enemy knew the truth that visual thinking is the strongest, most powerful language. Because if you think about it, in the whole wide world, you could learn tons of different verbal languages, but you would have trouble getting around if you don't know those languages. But no matter where you live in the world, we all understand what a visual image of a cat is. So visual images are like an international language across the globe. It's a very powerful language. And the enemy knew this. And so guess what? We put the very skill that would most develop our visual thinking on the lowest rung of the ladder of the educational system. There's no money for the arts. If a school's low on money, it's the arts that go. If you're low on time, it's arts that go. I'm telling you guys, if you are low on time, you need to change that paradox, flip it on its head, and realize that time spent in the arts, and this doesn't make any rational, logical sense. I know it doesn't. But if you will put time into learning the arts, God is going to open your mind to thoughts you never could have thought of without this training and without spending time in the visual arts. The visual arts bypasses all this logical, rational, judgmental. By the way, the arts are fabulous, you guys. You get so much more training in the arts than just the obvious learning how to draw. Because have you ever noticed that if any of you have ever drawn or painted, you lose your sense of time? And in the moment, you don't judge what you're doing. You're actually really, really loving what you're doing and you're enjoying it very, very much. Well, that is because you are in your right mind. My goal this week is to get all of you in your right mind finally. Sorry, cracking myself up. Because when you get in your right mind, you quit judging people, you quit judging yourself, you get out of that mode of issues with time and money and caring about what people think. Because the minute you get through with a drawing, often when people are done, that's when they shift back into what I call left-minded thinking. And when they shift into there, guess what? Oh, this is crap. This is no good. Well, I really had a lot of fun doing them, but now I'm not going to show it to anybody. I'm going to hang it on a wall. You guys, that is your left-minded thinking. And that goes totally against everything God wants to do. Okay. Couple other things I want to share this morning. One is, did you know there is a creativity crisis on the planet right now? And this is not me just saying it. It was on the front of Time magazine. It's been on the front of Newsweek magazine. And in fact, there's this professor. She wrote this book. I have her second book called The Creativity Challenge. Her first book, I think it was her first book, was called The Creativity Crisis. And she's a professor on creativity and innovation. And she is saying that even though academically, the kids seem to be getting smarter and smarter every year, creative thinking is going down every year. Well, now you guys know why. We've thrown one of the most valuable languages for creative thinking out of the school systems. And that's why art is so important, you guys. So there is a genuine creativity crisis, and this is why this is the perfect time for us to rise up and to increase our creative thinking skills. So I know that most people have thought of prophetic art as being primarily about sharing God's heart with people, and it is that, you guys, and it's super, super powerful reason to do art, and you should keep doing prophetic art. But I just want to take you up a level on the power and the purpose of prophetic art in God's heart, because he does want to bless people with his heart and with his love through the arts, but he wants to do more. He wants to release creativity. He wants to release innovations and solve problems that the world desperately needs, so that they are actually knocking at our door going, how are you doing this? You know, if you tell them, wow, well, I'm doing it through doing art, they're not going to believe it. Okay, so I want to tell you one more story to break you free that this really could be true for you, that you could be a genuine creative genius. And I've shared this story since 2008. You guys, God gave me this revelation of what I call the new 3 R's. This is the old school 3 R's. There's a new set of 3 R's, and the first one is art. And yes, people go, well, that does start with an R, Lynn, but how many of reading, writing, and arithmetic doesn't start with an R, right? But anyway, one of the stories that I've been sharing since way back then was a study that was done by NASA. And they hired a bunch of researchers, and what they discovered out of that study was so powerful that these researchers did their own research. And what they did is they took 1,600 very special people, okay? And they took these people and they tested them for genius. Now, how did they do that? They tested them for divergent thinking. Now, here's the interesting thing. They test for genius using divergent thinking, but nobody has ever been taught divergent thinking. Have you been taught divergent thinking? No, you haven't. Most of you, I'm sure, haven't. What is divergent thinking? Divergent thinking means coming up with more than one answer to a problem. The old analogy was you get a brick, and how many uses can you find for a brick? But we're not talking or teaching that in schools today. We're actually teaching convergent thinking, which is you better find the one right answer. And if you don't find the one right answer, you fail. And so we grow up thinking there's one right answer to every problem in the world. And that's why there's very little genius anymore, is because the one right answer is usually not the genius answer. The genius answer is usually about 20 to 100 to 123 answers down the road. But anyway, back to these 1,600 people. They tested them with a divergent thinking test. Okay. Guess how many of these 1,600 people had genius level thinking? I'm going to tell you. 98%. 98%. Now, what made them so special? Okay, I'm going to tell you. They were 5 years old. Okay? Then, here's the incredible part. They took these same 1,600 children from 5 years old, 5 years later, tested them with the same divergent thinking test, gave them the same test 5 years later. They're now averaging 10 years old. Guess how many hit genius level thinking? Okay, I'm going to tell you. 32%. 32%. They followed them for 5 more years. Now they're averaging 15 years old. Okay? Gave them the same identical divergent thinking test. Guess how many had genius level thinking? 10%. You see, when we enter our educational system, we're only taught academic thinking and convergent thinking. We're not taught divergent thinking or visual thinking, and we are slowly narrowed down into this tiny, I lost my train of thought here. We're narrowed down into very narrow thinking, which makes me think of the myopia epidemic. I'll tell you about the myopia epidemic in a minute. But anyway, these researchers, they were so shocked. I mean, down to 10% at 15 years old, genius level thinking. They took 220,000 adults, gave them the same divergent thinking test. And guess how many had genius level thinking out of those 220,000 adults? 2%. What is significant about that, besides the huge drop? What's significant about that is if you were to look up in Wikipedia and ask it how many people average in the world are geniuses today, guess how many percent? 2. 2 unrelated stories. But yet we have been de-geniusized, so only 2% of us hit genius level thinking anymore. And you know what? We can turn that around. That's the really cool thing. We can turn that around and think about it, guys. Do you think God is that scarcity minded? Our abundant God would go, I'm going to create this human race, but I think I'm only going to make a couple of them real geniuses. That does not sound like an abundant God to me. So I just want to say to you that, oh gosh, I have so much more I could share. What time is it? 11:20. The original study that was done by NASA that these researchers did? Here is the key. What they did, they were hired because they had all these engineers, right? And a very tiny 2% of them were genius engineers and the rest weren't. And they asked the researchers, how can we know ahead of time before we hire them that we are hiring the genius ones? How can we do that? So the researchers came in and they studied all their engineers, from the not so great engineers, mediocre, up to the genius engineers. And they studied all the demographics. They studied where they went to school, the kind of families they were raised in, what countries they were lived in, what kind of education they got. I mean, every kind of demographic they could find so that they could go back and say, here's the people you want to hire to NASA. Well, guess what? They could not find a commonality. There was no commonality except one fluke commonality. You know what that fluke was? I'm going to tell you. That fluke was that the ones who were genius engineers came in already believing, oh, there's my timer, came in already believing they were geniuses. They already believed it. So a key to your creativity, to your skill level, to your genius, and I have so much more I could say about that, but my half hour is up, is totally up to you and your belief and your willingness to do, as I shared in that little video about Moses. He turned away from his flock to see this curious event of a burning bush. You guys have turned away from your daily activities to this curious thing to see what God is saying. And I believe God is going to answer that. Okay, my half hour is up. But today I felt it was super important to give you guys an idea of who I am and what I'm all about, what my mission is. I believe God is releasing a movement of creative geniuses for a Renaissance remix. Okay, your play work today versus homework is I have given you 4 sheets to do. The first one is, and I know I've given you no training. Today was all mindset stuff and all about me. But your first thing is to do a piece of prophetic art. And I know you've had no training. You don't know how to do that. So what do you do, Lana? I don't know how to do prophetic art. Okay, well, paint whatever you want. I don't care about your skill level. I don't care if you can't draw a stick figure. Just paint whatever comes to your heart and mind. Now, what you do today is significant. You have to do today's exercises because at the end of the week, you will only be able to see how far you've come if you do today's exercises before you've gotten any training. So it's really important you do today's exercises. So you're going to do a prophetic art image. And if you have a blank white piece of paper, you have no clue where to start. Let me tell you a quick story about Churchill. I know I'm going over time. But Winston Churchill, when he was first learning how to paint, he was out in his own garden and he had an easel up and he had his white canvas out and he had his paint out and he was all ready to start and paint. But he was so intimidated by this big blank white canvas, he couldn't start. He didn't know where to start. And what happens is this woman called Lady Waverly or something, some lady, comes up in her big fancy car, drives up, and she happened to be an artist because a lot of people painted back then. And she drove up, she saw he was stuck. And you know what she did? She went, grabbed the paintbrush right out of his hand, put a big dollop of paint on it, and stroked it on the white canvas and went, there you go. And he realized that the audacity of that first paint stroke was what freed him up. So if you don't know what to do, get a brush, put a dollop of big yellow paint and put it across the piece of paper and then start and see what happens. Okay, homework number 2, I would want you to draw a face. Any face you want at all. I want you to just do it out of your head. And I want you to fill the page as much as you can. And I want you to make sure you paint some eyes into that face, okay? No dots, all right? Just do the best you can and don't worry. And don't spend a lot of time at these guys, you know, because I know your time is limited. The third one is I'd like you to draw an animal or paint an animal. It's totally up to you. And then in your fourth one, this is super important. And you'll probably think you don't have time, but whatever your 3 biggest ahas were today, write those down. Write them in your journal. You don't have to write them on the piece of paper I gave. Just make sure you write them down, because when you write them down, you are syncing that information from here down to here. Okay? All right. I did put it over 4 minutes, and I'm super excited to see all your comments. And I plan to meet you guys again here tomorrow morning at 11. I hope you enjoyed today. And just talk to me on your comments so I know where to take you the rest of the week. Okay? Love you guys.